Welcome everyone to this afternoon session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we'll be focusing on a new book by Duke University historian Simon Miles entitled Engaging the Evil Empire, Washington, Moscow, and the Beginning of the End of the Cold War, published last month by Cornell University Press. Joining us this afternoon are Elizabeth C. Charles of the U.S. State Department and Mary Serrati of Johns Hopkins University, who will be serving as discussants on our panel. I'm Eric Arneson from George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague, Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center. The seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly, usually, if not always, on Mondays. We have a very full lineup of authors and books for the remainder of the fall. If you're not on our listserv, I invite you to go to our organization's respective websites for the list of what we will be featuring over the next few months. Behind the scenes are two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And I'd like to thank two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of anonymous donors. As always, we invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, you should know today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our two institutions' websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of this webinar, we ask those with questions to use the raise hand function on Zoom, and then when called on, unmute yourself. To those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to rwheatley@historians.org. We will call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I turn this over to Christian Osterman, who will be moderating today's session. Christian.
Thanks, Eric. I'm delighted to introduce and moderate today's panel, which will begin a conversation about engaging the evil empire, Washington, Moscow, and the beginning of the end of the Cold War. A conversation to which we invite all of you in about 30 to 40 minutes. Again, feel free to use the raise hand function, the Zoom functionality, or email to Rachel Wheatley at rwheatley@historians.org. You can already get in line, so start raising your hands if you have a question. It'll give us a sense of how many questions are out there. We'd like to accommodate as many of you as possible. First up will be Dr. Simon Miles, the author of the book. Simon is assistant professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. He's a historian of the Cold War. He has published research in the Journal of Cold War Studies, Diplomatic History, and Diplomacy and Statecraft, some of the finest journals in the field. And of course, he is the author of the book that we'll be talking about today, Engaging the Evil Empire, his first book. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Texas, Austin, and he'll now talk for about 5 to 10 minutes about his book, after which I'll introduce our distinguished commentators. Simon, over to you.
Thanks so much, Christian. Thank you so much, Eric. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially here as so much of the historical scholarship that really got me excited about history. That's probably the reason that I am a historian. And I'll leave it up to the audience to decide whether that's for better or for worse, was so closely associated with the Wilson Center, especially the Cold War International History Project, and all the work that was being done by those who went before me. So it's a real treat to be here with you, and especially with Mary and Elizabeth giving some comments to which I look forward. This book started for me as a puzzle. This book started for me as a real puzzle. On the one hand, I was very familiar with the kind of Cold War story of I guess we could say the death of détente, if you will. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iran hostage crisis, events in Latin America and Africa too, that kind of spelled in the end for many people of US-Soviet condominium, if you will. And on the other hand, I knew very well the story of Reagan and Gorbachev, Reagan and Gorby, right? As Reagan had taken to calling him, strolling across Red Square, cooperation, the seeming transformation of the Cold War from conflict to cooperation. So much so that, I would say that that late 1980s period has kind of become one of the textbook cases of old rivals putting their differences aside. And the end of the Cold War itself is something which strikes me by its rapidity and also its kind of unexpectedness, right? It's there and then it's gone. And I especially wondered then, how did we get there? How do we get this end of the Cold War story? And how do we get there in a way which seems like such a swing, right? From the end of détente, from the end of US-Soviet cooperation to collaboration, cooperation between the two superpowers. And in particular, how do we get there during a period during which the story, the conventional story goes, the superpowers aren't even talking to one another, right? You have on the one hand, Reagan, who's maybe too ideologically focused to even talk to the Soviets. On the other hand, you have Soviet leaders who really kind of epitomize the gerontocracy charge. Konstantin Chernenko, for example, does not seem like a real doer to most people. So something has to have happened, it seemed to me, during those intervening years, the first half of the 1980s, that explain how we get from the late 70s to the late 1980s. And so with this project, I went looking for that. I went looking for an explanation that could maybe tell us something more than just the sort of second Cold War image of implacable hostility, but that could maybe show us what accounts for this transformation and also maybe prefigure some of the momentous shifts that we associate with the process of ending the Cold War. So I went looking in the archives. I went looking in the Soviet archives in Moscow. I went looking in the American archives in Simi Valley and Washington, D.C. And I went looking in the archives of a lot of their allies. One of the elements I'm really proud of about this book is its incorporation of a variety of perspectives on the Cold War, a variety of materials as well. And let me just run down kind of the three big things that I found. And then I think in the Q&A and the conversations, we'll probably flesh some of these out in greater detail. So I found first that the key to understanding both the speed and the scope of the changes of the late 1980s lies at the beginning of that decade. And the reason for that are two parallel shifts. First, a shift from a balance of power perceived to favor the Soviet Union to one more accurately perceived as favoring the United States, and also from a sort of war of words supplemented by back-channel dialogue to one of overt dialogue in the famous summits between Reagan and Gorbachev. So that's the first big thing that I found in writing this book, were these two shifts that explained trends which are locked in the first half of the 80s and which have such an influence on the latter half of the decade. Second, I found that whereas many have argued that Ronald Reagan was either kind of a flip-flopper on strategy towards the Soviet Union. Of course, some people have famously argued that Reagan had none. Some have even gone so far as to say that Reagan was kind of too much of a simpleton to have had one in the first place. I found that the United States actually implemented a pretty consistent approach to the Soviet Union, a dual-track grand strategy, if you will, which shaped both of those aforementioned processes. And the two elements thereof are basically carrot and stick. The former, the carrot, is what Reagan himself called quiet diplomacy. There's a lot of back-channel negotiating going on between East and West. A lot of deals are being done very quietly about, for example, human rights issues. But then the second element, the stick, is the famous peace through strength. The American military buildup, but also the ideological offensive, the political offensive of trying to bring American allies on board with the United States. And then the third point I want to make at the beginning, and this is really important to me because of the nature of the book, is that Moscow actually had strategies of its own, right? The Soviet Union is not just being acted upon, but rather is a pretty active participant in the Cold War at this time. Indeed, even under Leonid Brezhnev at the end of his life, Yuri Andropov, and then Konstantin Chernenko, as well as Mikhail Gorbachev. So I try to present these years not so much as an interregnum, but rather as a fairly consistent application of a pretty key tenet in the Soviet approach to policy, which is to reduce tensions, reduce Cold War tensions, in order to create breathing space for Moscow, in order to actually compete more effectively against the United States. I've said a lot, so I want to wrap it up there. But let me just say again, thank you to everyone in the audience for coming, and thank you to everyone for organizing this. I'm really looking forward to talking about this book.
Great, thanks, Simon. As mentioned, we have two distinguished, really wonderful commentators here with us today to start the conversation, Elizabeth C. Charles and Mary Lee Serratti. Elizabeth, Dr. Charles is a historian in the Office of the Historian at the US State Department, researching and compiling the Foreign Relations of the United States series. She completed the Reagan administration Foreign Relations volumes on the Soviet Union, 1983 to 1985 and 85 to 86, and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. She is now researching the George H.W. Bush records on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Elizabeth finished her PhD in modern Russian and Cold War history at the George Washington University in 2010 with a dissertation on the game changer, reassessing the impact of SDI on Gorbachev's foreign policy, arms control, and US-Soviet relations. She has an MA in Russian history from Boston College, and she currently serves as president of the Society for the History in the Federal Government. Society for the History in the Federal Government. She also serves as on the Curriculum and Training Committee for the National Council on Public History. Mary Serratti is the inaugural holder of the Kravis Distinguished Professorship of Historical Studies at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS. Most recently, she was the Dean's Professor of History and Professor of International Relations at University of Southern California, USC. She's also a research associate at Harvard University Center for European Studies. She earned her AB and at Harvard and her PhD in history at Yale University. She is the author, editor of 5 books, including most recently The Collapse, The Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall, and 1989, The Struggle to Create Post-Cold War Europe, both of which were selected as Financial Times Books of the Year, among many other distinctions and awards. Following graduate school, Mary served as a White House Fellow, then joined the faculty of the University of Cambridge, where she received tenure, only then to go off to teach at USC. She is a former Humboldt Scholar, a former member of the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She serves on the board of the Willy Brandt Foundation in Berlin. We will start with Mary, who has to depart a little early today to go and teach. I've asked each commentator to end their commentary with a couple of questions for Simon, and Simon will get a chance to immediately respond to the questions so we can start the conversation. Mary, the Zoom room is yours. Great to have you with us today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here. Also a real pleasure to acknowledge the work of a brilliant young scholar doing amazing work on the Reagan era, which we all sorely want to understand better because it is hugely important. And I was just casting my eye over the names of people in the audience, and it's a real testimony, Simon, to your work and its importance. The names of the people who are here, I see to name just a few that just popped up as they entered the room: Jay Stapleton Roy, Nate Jones, Sandy Vershbow, Avis Bolin, Chaba Beckish, David Holloway, James Mann, James Wilson, Bern Schaefer, Mary Dudziak, Mel Leffler, William Hill, Marcia Montianu, Roderick Braithwaite, Samuel Wells, Susan Ferber, a very impressive collection of colleagues, editors, and just participants in events. It's a real testimony, Simon, to the importance of your work. So it's great to be here today. And I recommend that you all buy the book. You can do it while I'm talking. Just go to indiebooks.com or Amazon or whatever it is you want. You don't even have to pretend to listen to me because I can't see anybody. So you can just go ahead and do that. Yeah, so I was told just to give you just a few minutes of thoughts because we want to make sure we get time for the audience. So I won't go into any great detail, but I am a huge fan of the book. I blurbed the book. I am particularly interested to learn about the beginning of the 1980s because the 1980s are very much a Janus-faced decade. So we start the war with at least this perception that there might potentially be nuclear conflict, and we end the war with the peaceful collapse of the Berlin Wall. And the first half of the 80s is very different from the second half of the 80s. And because of the extreme difficulty of working as a scholar at the Reagan Library, in my view, the first half of the decade is actually under-researched compared to the second half. I've had the good advantage of working with the excellent archivists at the George H.W. Bush Library, who have really bent over backwards to help me with my mandatory review requests that I've been filing since the beginning of actually the end of the last century. And everyone who works in that area knows that there is a large amount of documents out in the public domain. And I'm really pleased to hear that Elizabeth Charles is actually working now on bringing even more out. Whereas the Reagan Library, not for lack of trying by the staff, but somehow the weight at the Reagan Library is much more on its function as a museum and as a platform for events than for research. And it is really fiendishly difficult to work there. So it really is a credit to Simon that he's been able to start getting things out. It's becoming kind of an odd hole in the historiography because we have good scholarship now on Bush. And I'm currently, I recently got a bunch of documents declassified from the Clinton Presidential Library, most notably the transcripts of conversations between Clinton and Yeltsin. And I'm personally currently finishing a book manuscript on NATO expansion from 1989 to 1999, taking the story forward into the Clinton years. But we still have this hole of the Reagan years. So it's great to have Simon's book starting to fill this hole. And so it was wonderful to see documentation of this dual track approach. This idea that there was no Reagan reversal, because obviously that's a persistent theme, that there was somehow this complete about-face by President Reagan between the first and second term. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that from you, Simon. I was particularly interested to read, Simon, where you wrote that there was no Reagan reversal, because I know Ambassador Matlock, and he has always consistently said that. And it's good to see it. I have only the highest regard for Ambassador Matlock, and it's good to see it confirmed independently by scholars. It's important, as John Lewis Gaddis says, and the scholars in the room know this, that the history of these events be written not just by participants in them, but also by historians. As John Gaddis has written, a participant in events doesn't necessarily have the best view because your perceptions extend no farther than your own senses. A participant, by definition, is participating. You're down on the ground level and you're surrounded by people, and you obviously know exactly what's going on in detail, but you don't have perspective. So it's useful to have a historian's perspective as well. As John Gaddis has written, a historian's perspective is that of an observer from a distant height. You lose the detail, but the perspective is much greater. So it's good to have both accounts by participants like Ambassador Matlock, and now also from a height, Professor Miles. So I just have one area I wanted to zero in on because it's of interest to me in my current writing on NATO expansion in the 90s. At one point in the book, Simon, you talk about page 49, if those of you already have the book, about ways that the Kremlin hoped to use the debate over intermediate range nuclear forces to, quote, break NATO. In other words, to play on this tension between, on the one hand, the NATO and the United States saw as a strategic necessity of having those weapons, because of course the conventional line in Germany was a relatively thin line for the Soviets to punch through, and so you wanted those weapons there to defend against the Soviet Union. On the other hand, the tension between the US and NATO conviction that those forces were necessary versus the popular revulsion at them. And Moscow was looking for ways to leverage that discontent to break NATO. I'm interested in that because this comes up again later once the wall comes down as a way to try to put the brakes on German unification. Valentin Folly, and this is later after the wall comes down, suggests to Gorbachev, how about we propose some kind of a referendum where we say to Germans, you can have your unification if you give up the nuclear weapons on your soil, particularly the short-range ones. By then, the INF Treaty has come into effect. And Folling thought this would be a win-win because he thought either the West and Helmut Kohl would simply not have this referendum at all, which would be a public relations coup for Moscow, because then Moscow could say we're more on the side of paying attention to public opinion than the West, or they would have this referendum and there was a fighting chance that, you know, Moscow's favored side would win. That people would say, yeah, for unification, we'll give up these nuclear weapons. You know, the shorter the range, the deader the Germans. Why do we want them anyway? So I'd be interested in your thoughts about how that's playing out in the earlier 1980s. Because, and this would just be the last thing I said, I really can't stress this, that the landscape of the 80s really switches in the middle of the decade. And so working on the early 80s is different than the 90s, in the late 80s and 90s. I think in the future, for example, historians who work on 2020, there's so much going on. Some historians will say, I work on October 1st, 2020, but only on Twitter. You know, we'll have to get that specific. The 80s aren't quite that bad, but the 80s are such a rich decade that it really is a meaningful difference to say I work on the early 80s than, versus I work on the late 80s. And as someone who's been working on the late 80s for a while, it's great to have some company on the early 80s. So thank you, Simon, for writing this book.
Great. Thanks, Mary. Simon, do you want to respond to Mary's question?
Yeah, happily. If I could, maybe I'll actually pick up on your point about the quantity of information. Right, and it's so true that as time progresses, the quantity of material that requires declassification, it grows, I think, logarithmically. It's fair to say, such that once we get into the world of Tandberg machines and BBM and things like that, I really feel for those whose job it is to do the public's work and to get that information out, including, of course, Elizabeth and her colleagues at the Office of the Historian at the State Department. But you mentioned some of the challenges, and you know, part of the solution to that was sort of dogged use of MDR requests to the extent that I could, and to the extent that those came, you know, in time. I spent 5 years getting my PhD, and that was not enough time for a great many of those requests to be completed, and I'm still waiting on some of those, and it's been a couple of years since I finished. So part of my approach with this book was to try to find back doors, right? And of course that was applicable to the Russian case, where some of the Eastern Bloc nations, especially East Germany, of course, Czechoslovakia, and also Ukraine, provide a real wealth of scholars, of material for scholars who want that Eastern Bloc perspective, but who maybe can't necessarily get it in Russia. Though I have to stress that the Russian archives right now are extraordinarily open. I mean, the amount of material that you can get now in Moscow is pretty spectacular in terms of things which had been open for only a brief amount of time in the 1990s, were closed down in the sort of mid Yeltsin years, and have now been opened back up, and I make use of some of that in this book, and I'm working in those materials right now for another project. So where that led me was indeed, I want to talk about the reversal, and then I want to talk about INF, which are, I think, the other things that Mary has charged me with. So the Reagan reversal story makes a lot of sense, right? Because if we focus, as a lot of the key works which put forward this argument did, because they were so recent, if we focus on the public elements of this, that's absolutely what you see. You know, you get Evil Empire speech, that's mid 83. Before that, late 82, you have kind of the Westminster speech, you know, communism, ash heap of history. And there's a lot of really harsh rhetoric. And then it really does change quite quickly. So the way I deal with the Reagan reversal thesis is by saying, okay, what else is going on here? Right? What else is actually happening under the hood, if you will, of American policy? And that's where, to me, the picture becomes a lot more complicated. On the one hand, some of the catalysts that have been put forward as having sort of catalyzed this reversal look different to me using international archival sources. The alleged near miss with nuclear war, for example, but also a lot of internal political kind of bureaucratic politics elements, but also what's actually happening, right? What's actually happening. Reagan didn't just decide, for example, in January 1984 that he wanted to talk to the Soviets. He decided that back in the mid-1970s. He was actually, at the same time as he was, for political reasons, lambasting Jerry Ford for doing it, and then, of course, lambasting Jimmy Carter for doing it, he was also saying publicly that, you know, we need to find a way to talk with them and make progress on matters of mutual interest. So Reagan starts singing this tune in the 70s, and in the 80s, he starts implementing it really quite quickly. In the book, I highlight, for example, an episode in Berlin where the Reagan administration maintains a very sustained back-channel dialogue between the U.S. ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany, to West Germany, and the Soviet ambassador to East Germany, to the German Democratic Republic. And the former, Arthur Burns, Reagan's appointee, shows up. And he says, Ronald Reagan sent me here to use this as a forum for discussion, for conversation, to try to keep the Cold War under control, to try to keep it cold. So thus, what I see is not really a reversal, but rather a shift in emphasis. It's a shift in emphasis from more of the buildup. And it's important to stress here, whatever Reagan's kind of lionization today may be, in 1980, 1981, Reagan is not like American optimism personified. He's the opposite. He's so pessimistic, as are many of the people on his team who are saying the Soviets have us beat in strategic arms. They've had us beat since forever in conventional forces in Europe. We're in really big trouble here, folks. And then you have kind of stagflation, the economic disasters, kind of the demoralization of the American public, et cetera. So as the US situation improves, Reagan is more and more confident, and his advisors are more and more confident, in particular, as you said, Mary, Ambassador Matlock, whom we're privileged to count as a colleague here at Duke, but also George Shultz, who really pushed this agenda forward of doing more overt as opposed to covert engagement. So that's how I think about it. And to me, this is also just, you know, if I can say, as someone who not only teaches history, but teaches strategy, this is good strategy, right? Good strategy is responsive to changing realities, whether that's at home or abroad. You know, good strategy is interactive in a sense. As what Reagan calls quiet diplomacy bears fruit, he keeps doing it because it's road tested, right? And then your question about INF and NATO, I think, is such an interesting one because it shows how much more is going on in this period than just the superpowers. You know, that is a civil society question too, right? And INF, especially in the early 1980s, is an extremely, extremely fraught subject. At home. Some of the biggest protests in the histories of some of Europe's great cities are over the INF issue, especially in Germany, which is going to be the home of Pershing II ballistic missiles. There's big questions about whether Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands will even accept the deployment of NATO nuclear weapons on their territory at military installations there. This is the era of, you know, the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, which of CND, right, and a whole kind of universe of peace organizations, not only in Western Europe. I think it's important to stress. There's also, for example, a robust East German peace movement. Yes, indeed, in Western Europe, funded in part by the Soviet Union or by the East Germans. Often the East Germans were kind of the conduit for the cash and for the various forms of support, but not, you know, made up of kind of communist sympathizers, made up of people who were really worried about inviting nuclear attack on their homes with the presence of these weapons. And that's not a uniquely European phenomenon. Look at the Midwest, right? And the Minutemen, those who live around the Minuteman silos, they too, ranchers and things like that, have really grave concerns about living next to a giant bullseye, so to speak. So the Soviets see this as a really useful opportunity. And that's why they're putting a lot of money and effort into trying to drive a wedge. If they can call into question whether or not the military element of the NATO alliance, a military alliance, is actually viable, this strikes a lot of people in the Kremlin as a really valuable opportunity to try to call into question some of the ancient, you know, the old Cold War issues. Will the United States really trade New York for Paris? Or Chicago for Bonn, or, you know, what have you, for West Berlin, right? So using NATO, INF to break NATO is appealing to the Soviets. It's cheap in the grand scheme of, you know, the ways you can test NATO's viability. And certainly when the West German Bundestag in November '83 finally votes to accept the Pershing IIs, this is a really big setback for the Soviets as they see it. But it's also a real disappointment to a lot of people around Eastern Europe. Take, for example, around Western Europe as well, I should say, around Europe. Take, for example, the US invasion of Grenada, right? In 1983, which is done invading a Commonwealth country with no notice to the UK. Margaret Thatcher herself starts saying, well, wait a minute. You're putting nuclear weapons on my territory, and if you'll do that without giving us a heads up, what are you going to do with those awfully powerful tools? So this is, I think, a key part of that story. Thank you for those questions and for your extremely generous comments.
Thanks. Let's bring in Elizabeth into the conversation. Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm incredibly pleased to be here and discuss this amazing new book. I know Simon has been working on this project for a long time, and I cannot talk enough about the breadth and depth of archival research, and all of the archives he went to just really makes this book shine and shows us what you can do with looking at allies, archives, and digging around in places that you may not think you're going to find things. Really allows you to get the nuances of these stories of the two superpowers out during this period. I do need to start with my disclaimer that these views are mine, not that of the Department of State, the US government. And all of my comments are going to be based today solely on declassified and publicly available materials. So now that that is out of the way, much like Simon, I have worked with these characters and documents and in these archives for far too long, and lived with these people, and their decision making and how they work is really, really fascinating. But Simon has done us all a great service by filling an enormous gap in this literature. Most books on the end of the Cold War start with Gorbachev, start in 1985, go to 1991, talk about perestroika, glasnost, and how Gorbachev's reforms really impacted what happened in 1991. But as Simon shows us with this book, you know, in this understudied period, the currents of these events were really there. I know very well from my work in the office on the Fruce volumes that I've completed with my colleague James Wilson, who completed the other two Reagan Soviet volumes. We see the documentation of Reagan reaching out, talking to the Soviets, trying to open this dialogue, but it is all behind the scenes. It is not public. In public, like Simon said, you get from the Soviets and from the US very bellicose rhetoric about the evils of the other side, the evil empire. how the Soviet system just didn't work and wouldn't function. But this is all in public. It's the behind the scenes that really shine through in Simon's book. And to me, it's the primary word in his title, engaging. And that runs throughout this entire narrative. Is behind the scenes, we see Secretary of State Shultz consistently talking to Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin. We see Ambassador Hartmann in Moscow engaging with his Soviet counterparts when possible. We see Shultz and Gromyko meeting on the fringes of UN meetings, any other international meetings where they could. So they're trying to find a way to communicate. They're trying to open this dialogue. And in one of Simon's footnotes, which I think I found it entertaining, you hid this in a footnote, Simon. Footnote 243 was Andropov saying, remember Andropov's reminder to Bush at Brezhnev's funeral that neither superpower should allow strong rhetoric for domestic consumption to influence the substance of international relations. And to me, that encapsulates what this book is really about and telling us is in public, we may say things, but diplomatically behind the scenes, we're trying to work, figure out a way to make this relationship more fruitful and engaging with each other. Now, why this is happening is what's most important and where Simon really shines through with his analysis. He explains to us that the Soviet Union needed this breathing space. Andropov recognized this, Chernenko to the extent he was able to. I really enjoyed your analysis of Chernenko and how Gromyko and Ustinov really were behind the scenes running things. I thought that was fascinating. I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that. But it is how these leaders were making decisions to engage, to get the breathing space they needed because they recognized that Reagan and the US were on an economically better footing. Peace through strength was working. So in order to get where the Soviet Union needed to be to try to improve its economic situation, they were going to have to cooperate with the US. Once we get Gorbachev, all of this clearly changes very dramatically. And Gorbachev is much more well-positioned to make all of this happen. The other thing I think Simon's book really does is put this in the global context. It tells the story of the US and Soviets and how they were trying to engage, but it also talks about the allies on each side, how the Warsaw Pact leaders were meeting with US officials, how US officials were meeting, with people in East Germany, people were meeting in London, people were meeting all over the place, really trying to talk all of this through. So I thought that was interesting, Simon. I wish we'd had more of that, but I believe that was probably an issue of, space and trying not to write too long a book. But I think you do an excellent job of really weaving in all the dramatic events and issues, especially 1983, as we know, was very tumultuous with the shoot down of KAL, the INF missiles being deployed. So, what's in it for either side to keep engaging, to keep talking? And you really delve into that. And that's where this book really provides us with some excellent analysis of this period that just hasn't been studied enough until now. So my two questions I'll start out with is you mentioned that within each government, within the Soviet government and the US government, there are definitely factions who do not want Reagan to engage with the Soviets and who don't want the Soviet leadership to try to go back to détente and engaging with the US. So this comes out in the book, but I wonder if you could just flesh that out a little more and kind of talk about those factions and how Reagan is able to kind of push down people like John Lankowski and Weinberger and kind of make them realize he's serious about talking to the Soviets for the following reasons. But the same thing from the Soviet side. I think we really need to know more about the Soviet grand strategy, what they're trying to do. But, I wrote in my dissertation about Gorbachev dealing with these military factions and making arms control deals. But I think some more discussion of that would really be interesting. And also, I think what policy by maybe Andropov or Chernenko kind of laid the foundation for Gorbachev that maybe we underappreciate, that we're not thinking enough about. And do you have one or two ideas of things that kind of they started that then Gorbachev was just able to run with? So I have more questions, but I will stop there for now and just say that I really enjoyed reading this book. The footnotes and the archival use is incredible, and just thank you for writing it. And I will look forward to a fruitful discussion with all of these amazing participants.
It's great. Thanks so much, Simon.
Thanks so much. So much there. And with an eye on the clock, I am going to not give as full an answer as I could to that pair of excellent questions. Let me just make the following kind of brief remarks. I too wish that there had been a lot more on the kind of the allies in here. And in order to scratch that itch, I'm writing an international history of the Warsaw Pact. But that will be a little bit of time coming, but I'm looking forward actually to using some of the material that was on the cutting room floor, as it were, for this project to drive that project, or at least part of it. So on the factions issue, this I think is such an important element because not only at the time in a lot of government, except for those parts which were really intensely focused on Kremlinology, if you will, but also in a lot of the popular perceptions of the Soviet Union then and now, it's very much a monolith, right? Indeed, even the phrase "evil empire" connotes there being an emperor who runs the show. And what I found for this period, and so many other people who have done work on the Soviet Union before me and of course after me, find is that really it's a lot more complicated than that. So in fact, I could probably answer both of your questions by, for example, talking about the Andropov coterie, right? People within the KGB, but also within the Central Committee's International Department, who had a really strong sense that all was not well. There's a wonderful memoir by the head of the analytical section of the KGB, Nikolai Leonov, who talks about defections, and not high-profile defections, not your Oleg Gordievskys, but rather young KGB officers, probably on their first postings in the West, who've kind of gone through all of the ideological vetting, get to the West, and then say, this is for me. This is for me. That's the information that Andropov is seeing, but a lot of other people in the leadership, especially the Politburo, aren't seeing. And Leonov talks about how Andropov says, okay, this tells me something about our country, right? About where we are vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So the answer I would give to the kind of the Andropov policy is actually the fostering of this coterie of, they called themselves the free thinkers, right? And the creation of an environment in which they could come a lot closer to speaking truth to power than anyone could elsewhere in the Soviet Union. Who is probably the most famous of their number? Of course, Mikhail Gorbachev, right? Who comes into office with a keen understanding of the full picture of the Soviet Union's problems. That's why I argue he's willing to go a lot further than anyone else was, though both Andropov and Chernenko understand this. I'm glad you enjoyed the inclusion of Chernenko. One of my mentors as a graduate student, Mary's colleague Frank Gavin, always described me as America's preeminent Chernenko revisionist, and I don't believe that he meant it as a compliment. With apologies to Frank if he's on this call, but I wear that badge proudly because I see a lot of interesting, I wouldn't necessarily say policy innovations, but because a lot of what he's doing is going back to the Brezhnev playbook, but he's very aware of the problems. And in some ways he's aware of the problems, and so he turns to some older solutions. There's a whole power struggle going around him, and thus some of these efforts are confounded. Of course, the fact that his kidneys don't work also confounds some of these efforts. And then in the United States, George Shultz is such a key figure here because he is an extremely skilled political operator, but he can also deliver results, right? So when the Lenkowskis and the Weinbergers are trying to stymie these efforts, not only can Schultz go around them within the bureaucratic wrangling, but also he comes back with a win pretty consistently. And that's, very, very meaningful in terms of actually shaping American policy. So I see those as kind of the key elements here, and Andropov does indeed introduce certain economic policies which prefigure in some ways perestroika. Not so much Glasnost, that given his KGB background is certainly something that he's a lot more reticent about touching. Gorbachev, thus, a real innovator in that regard, but he sets a little bit of an establishment of a precedent. It's very popular to say only Nixon could go to China. And that's kind of neither here nor there, but Andropov certainly had the bona fides to say, we need to change this. This is not working without kind of undermining the system. Gorbachev takes that and runs with it, and ultimately, does real damage to the system. That's not a value judgment. That's just an observation. So that's a key element, I think, also of that. But thank you for again your extremely generous comments and for those questions.
Thanks so much. We're quickly getting to the Q&A session, and I do want to give the audience a chance to chime in. If I know, Mary, you have to run. Is there anything that's uppermost on your mind that you would like to ask Simon? Otherwise, I'll see if Elizabeth, if she has another question, might come in a little bit later in the discussion. But I know you have to run, Mary. Anything urgent?
No, I only wanted to say, by the way, the photo behind me is the Reagan Ranch, which I pulled up in honor of Simon Miles's visit. I recommend a visit to it. It's really a very interesting place. And totally unrelated, I'd like to encourage everyone to vote. Am I allowed to do that?
Is there an election coming up?
Yeah, there is.
Oh.
But other than that, I wanted to give time to the audience because Simon, you really have an amazing crowd. I know you've been talking, Simon, so you haven't been able to scroll through the attendees like I have, but it's really a who's who. So I say we go to the audience as soon as possible because there's real depth of expertise out there.
Excellent. Thanks, Mary. Elizabeth, I'll try if there are further questions to weave you in a little bit later in the conversation. Let me, however, sort of ask a couple of questions and also give Eric a chance, and then we'll open it up. Simon, if you could probably be a little bit more concise, that would allow us to accommodate a few more questions. The Wilson Center is the home to the Cold War National History Project, and obviously we've focused on making accessible materials from the other side, the Soviet side, over the years. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about the materials you've looked at. You mentioned the US side and the difficulties there, but I think it's important for you to talk a little bit about the Russian and other documentation, and to what extent that goes beyond what has already been uncovered and published in recent years, especially for the Gorbachev period, where we've seen a lot of new work coming out. And secondly, perhaps since that plays such a big role, if you could talk a little bit more about, your book is explicitly about both sides, about the Moscow end and especially the Gorbachev factor, breathing Gorbachev's intention to create breathing spell for resuming the competition would strike some people as a reductionist interpretation of what Gorbachev was all about, and underestimating the qualitative difference that the world got with this Soviet leader. So if you can respond to that, because I think that's one of the major arguments in the book, at least indirectly, that you make.
Yeah, happily, Christian. And I'll try to do so briefly, although, oh boy, you make that hard by asking me to talk about all of the wonderful Eastern Bloc archival materials under those auspices. But let me do my best to answer both in a brief manner. You know, you can get an enormous amount of material in Russia, and I have. And Mary mentioned some of the slowness of declassification at the Reagan Library. There is a lot of material that you can get, for example, the Russian side of a memorandum of conversation from Argani, the Russian State Archive of Contemporary History in Moscow, where the American side is still classified. And I humbly submit that no one should be happy about that status quo. And it's certainly, you know, when in my interactions with folks in the U.S. government, it's a point I like to make, and you know, I cite the specific episodes, and that's not unique to the United States. There's others there. So my approach was to basically built on a kind of I guess we could say a network understanding of how alliances work, right? Even if you accept the most sort of top-down interpretations of what the Warsaw Pact was, and I don't, and I try to argue against a lot of that in this book. In order to tell someone what to do, you still need to tell them what to do, right? You need to explain what they're supposed to say, what they're supposed to do, what they're supposed to think, etc. And that leaves a paper trail, a voluminous paper trail. And thus that gives us access to the thinking in Moscow, even if only as kind of distilled and packaged for the consumption of their allies. And sometimes it also just gives us access to stories that haven't been told before. I mentioned earlier the Berlin back channel. I've never seen explicit American documents about this. I've seen some material from Arthur Burns' papers, which if you know about it, makes more sense in that context. But I've never seen the American side of this, nor have I seen actually the Russian original sides. I came across purely by accident, if I'm very honest with you, all of these memcons in the East German Communist Party archives, translated from Russian into German. And that's the promise to me of this approach to research. Of course, as you said, Christian, an approach which is so deeply connected to the work that the Wilson Center and the Cold War International History Project have been doing. On Gorbachev, you know, I could talk for a very long time about this. So let me just make the point, and this might sound a little cryptic, but I don't mean it to be. The Gorbachev of 1989 is a very different Gorbachev than the Gorbachev of 1985. And for better or for worse, I think for better, this book ends with Gorbachev of 1985. So yes, there are real evolutions in his thinking. I would argue, as an extension of the argument I make in this book, though, that some of those have been extremely skillfully packaged in the past as being, you know, very kind of pure liberal-minded policy shifts, but at the time were very, very much driven by needs. In particular, the needs for anything approaching a diplomatic win, even if it was just the successful conclusion of a summit, because things were going so poorly at home. But the Gorbachev of 1985, for example, almost immediately after coming into power, excoriates the United States for caring about human rights. And I talk about that in the book in the 5th chapter, his real, and it jumps off the page here, his real frustration, it jumps off the original pages, I wouldn't say that about my own, his real frustration with all of this American hypocrisy about human rights. Very different Gorbachev in 85 than, of course, the Gorbachev of 89. So that's not the full answer, but with an eye on the clock, that's where I'm going to leave it.
Yeah, appreciate that. Eric?
Thank you. So I am not a specialist in the 1980s, so take this question as an outsider's engagement with the subject. If I read this correctly, and if I hear you correctly, the impression that one gets quite clearly, or at least I got quite clearly, is that the first half of the decade successfully kind of laid the foundation for American success in the second half of the decade. And there is something of a way in which you portray quite, I think, positively the Reagan administration's approach to dealing with the Soviets. Then there is a paragraph that you have in the introduction about what you don't cover in the book. And you say that for thinking holistically about Reagan's foreign policy, moving past the partisan rhetoric on both sides, the failings cannot be ignored no matter the success in his dealings with the Soviet Union. And those failings, as you list them, center on American policy in Central America. With the Contras in Nicaragua, the efforts to overthrow the Sandinistas, the human rights violations and deaths in El Salvador. So could you bring those back into the picture? And the same Reagan who is kind of thoughtfully kind of pursuing his grand strategy in the first half of the 1980s is beginning to lay waste to Central America. So if you could just bring that into the picture, and how does that temper, or if you had twice the number of pages that Cornell allowed you, how would that factor in?
Well, it's a critical question, Eric. And of course, there's also, you didn't mention this, but I think there's also a whole conversation to be had on domestic policy as well. And I think a lot of this story, holistically, as you very rightly say, has to do with Ronald Reagan's leadership style, or as we could probably more accurately term it, lack thereof. Reagan was I think it's fair to say, a very bad manager. You can regularly read, for example, in internal departmental memos, everyone walking out of an NSC meeting believing that they've been given the green light to do whatever it is they want to do by the president, which, if you know what they're talking about, is impossible because it's predicated on the other one not being allowed to go forward. So people are walking out of these meetings taking a lot of license. And then, of course, we see in, for example, the Iran-Contra scandal, taking a lot of liberties, to put it extremely, extremely, extremely mildly. So Reagan was very focused on the US-Soviet question. Absolutely true. And part of the reason I kind of feel that I can get away with this focus is that it mirrors the president's. And this is the policy issue, the foreign policy issue in particular, which has his fingerprints the most on it. Latin America, of course, is beyond a tragic story of American policy. And in a lot of senses, it was allowed to become that by the vicious cycle of a degree of indifference on the part of Reagan, but an overall ideological tenor which he sets, which says that fighting communism is kind of an innately good thing, right? And a lot of aides, thus, who are in regional roles or functional roles say, okay, well, I want to fight communism, and I'm going to do that in Latin America because that's my purview. And then there's also the element of the proximity and the thinking in a lot of American government circles at the time, and this is not unique to the Reagan administration by any stretch, that there's a lot more room for maneuver because Latin America, the United States' backyard. And the feeling that what is acceptable there is things are acceptable there which might not be acceptable elsewhere. So were I to write kind of a bigger book, and this would probably be a much less positive book about the Reagan administration, because those failings are serious, they're grave, and they absolutely matter, which is why I try to acknowledge them in the introduction. And Reagan, of course, I am a big believer in responsibility and the fact that the person whose name is on the shop bears responsibility. But when it comes to where Reagan's really involved on a lot of issues that aren't US-Soviet relations, he really takes a back seat. One of the challenges of writing this book was that you look through kind of National Security Council minutes and the president is almost absent sometimes. It's in other smaller meetings, the meeting after the meeting, you know, etc., where he really makes his views known. And Latin America is not just, you know, this doesn't excuse anything, but is one of those cases where you see some of this playing out with tragic and disastrous consequences. But thank you for that question. That's an important element, Eric.
Thanks so much. Let's go to audience questions. First, I'd like to call on Ambassador Roderick Braithwaite. Please unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Well, I thought that was a fascinating and very thought-provoking discussion. I wanted to make some brief points. Firstly, about I envy all you historians who write proper history, but of course you couldn't write history without the documents, and the documents are produced by the participants, so you need both. There was Mary made a point at the beginning about participants. Of course, we have a narrow view, and everybody who writes about anything has a narrow view, and that includes historians. A second point was the whole policy towards the Soviet Union of carrots and sticks, of course, goes back well before Reagan. It starts perhaps with the Hamel Doctrine, or even earlier, but the Hamel formalized it in the late 60s with the NATO Doctrine, which specifically spelt out the need to engage and deter both. So it's an old idea. Thirdly, I think it goes to the question of perceptions, which was mentioned at the beginning. I think that the perception that the Americans had that the Soviets were overwhelming at the beginning of the 80s was, of course, matched by an equal and opposite perception among the Russians that it was the Americans who were overwhelming. And I think not enough attention paid either by diplomats and intelligence analysts, or perhaps they have less excuse by historians, to the question of how the players perceive the situation as well as what the situation actually is. The Russians, of course, started worrying about their situation under Khrushchev, and Khrushchev tried to change it, lost his job as a result. But throughout the 70s, you have one Soviet after another saying this is not working. And a lot of people gave considerable and sophisticated intellectual input into try and deal with the problem at that time. And so when Gorbachev arrived, he was arriving well prepared. He didn't spring like Palestine, fully armed. He came out of a background. And I think, so I think that both the idea that there was a Reagan change in 1983 to 4, or indeed that there was a Gorbachev change after 1985, are oversimple. I'm sure that's not what the book says, and I haven't, of course, read it yet. But anyway, thank you for a very stimulating discussion.
Thanks very much. Simon, would you like to respond to that? If not,
let me briefly say, you know, the point is very well taken that this Reagan is not the first person to kind of implement such an approach. Your reference to the Harmel report is spot on. And hopefully, if you do read the book, you'll find perhaps just the Reagan spin on that approach, and indeed on the question of perception, which you rightly raise is so critical to all of Cold War history.
Thank you. Let me call next on William Hill, please. Please unmute yourself. William Hill.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks very much for a fascinating presentation. I've not read the book. I look forward to very much to going through it because I witnessed a number of the things that you describe and analyze in it from a very junior position, to be sure. I have one short comment that perhaps you have a reaction to, and one question. On Andropov, I'm not sure that the non-KGB aspects of his background are fully appreciated in wider or more popular histories of the Soviet Union, and in particular his stint before he moved over to the KGB as head of the International Department of the Central Committee, where he's assembled around him a cast of analysts and many of whom then appear much later as architects of perestroika. Now, Andropov certainly chose a different path once he came back to the Politburo and made his push for general secretary. I just wonder to what extent you deal with that aspect. In terms of question involves the Reagan administration, and I'm wondering to what extent you find changes or changes in key personnel had influence on the direction and development of US policy toward the Soviet Union. For example, we don't get George Shultz until a couple of years into the administration. Secondly, Reagan starts out with a chief national security advisor on Russia, Richard Pipes, and then ends up with Jack, or later moves to Jack Matlock. Certainly quite different approaches toward and different experiences in dealing with the Soviets. So I wonder, not having seen it, to what extent, or does that sort of personnel dynamic enter into your analysis? Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me answer those as briefly as I can. On the point of Andropov's pre-KGB background, absolutely critical, especially the international department. And as I was saying in response to Elizabeth's early question about Andropov's policies, I actually rank that as one of the most important things he does, is bringing this coterie around him, which is the kernel of the people of the kind of team that implements glasnost and perestroika in '85 and onward. So I think that's absolutely critical. And I do also agree with you that Andropov as the kind of the specter of the KGB sort of, I think, can be really overplayed in terms of what his policy views are. For example, he's the loudest voice against any kind of intervention in Poland in the early 1980s. Vice, his policies towards Prague and Czechoslovakia in '68 and Hungary in '56. Personnel is key, and I could talk for a very long time about this, so I'll simply say that the arrival of people like George Shultz and Jack Matlock, who are really actually in step with how Reagan thought about the Cold War, how Reagan thought about the Soviet Union, is vital in enabling the president and the others around him to really execute on this strategy successfully. So I give a lot of credit to Jack Matlock, to George Shultz, also to George H.W. Bush, the vice president, who's also a strong voice in this camp during the really tough internecine battles, including Richard Pipes, who is not totally opposed to this, but certainly doesn't want to go as far as, for example, Reagan himself. So thank you very much for those 2 points.
Thank you. If the members of the audience could introduce themselves just briefly by name and affiliation, if you like, I think that'd be helpful. I forgot to mention it at the outset. Andreas Etges.
Okay, my audio is working. Thank you for letting me ask a question, and thank you for the presentation, which I really enjoyed. I haven't read the book yet, but I will. I myself took part in some of the large demonstrations you talked about back in the 80s. A couple of questions, I want a combined one. Why did the Reagan people choose the back channel diplomacy while at the same time using this extreme rhetoric? And of course, the arms buildup was another part of that policy, which we saw as very dangerous, which meant we so many in Europe and many in the US would not want to support the Reagan administration and were really skeptical of what it wanted to do. But then through some of the things you said and some of the others who might have read the book, so did Reagan have this big strategy, that blueprint to end the Cold War? Again, I haven't read the book, but it sounded like you were talking about this, something like a grand strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. Question, Simon, about the grand strategy.
Yeah.
Question mark.
So grand strategy question mark. As someone who teaches a course on grand strategy, I should add the question mark to the title. So why choose the kind of the quiet diplomacy and the very overt undiplomatic statements? I think the basic answer to this is that the Reagan administration didn't feel in the early 1980s that they were in a position that they could turn overt diplomacy into success. Right? There is a strong feeling that they don't want to just sort of talk for talking's sake, that if they're going to do something big like a summit, that there needs to be actual results. And they felt that at this point, they wouldn't actually be able to get the results that they wanted out of them. That's why they focus on, yes, indeed, the hair-raising rhetoric and also the perhaps equally hair-raising military approach, but that also buys leverage, right? And so, for example, the investments in things like miniaturized and highly accurate nuclear missiles, we can see how that benefits the US bargaining position later on, and for example, the INF treaty. Reagan didn't have a blueprint to end the Cold War because he didn't think it was going to end in his lifetime. At the beginning of his administration, there's a strong consensus amongst his team that the Soviet Union would probably be around for another 60 years. There was no sense that Reagan was going to be alive to witness the end of the Soviet Union. Of course, he was wrong on that. So rather than seeing this as kind of a blueprint to end the Cold War, I would say it was a blueprint to reduce Cold War tensions on American terms, right? Thus, I would say that the desiderata of the Reagan grand strategy are one, American comparative advantage vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and two, greater stability in the international system, probably by reducing the overall levels of nuclear armaments. And here, I describe Reagan's strong personal views, kind of nuclear abolitionism, if you will, which was something he very much wanted to realize. So it's not so much a blueprint to end the Cold War or to win the Cold War, but rather it's a kind of an ontologic kind of mindset to how to deal with the challenge posed by the Soviet Union in ways that favor American interests. But thank you for those questions.
Thanks, Simon. I'd like to go to John Kolchitsky. John Kolchitsky. Sorry for butchering your name there.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure this out. Your pronunciation of my name was very good. I'm a university professor emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I wanted to ask, what role did the Solidarity trade union activities in Poland in the 1980s, what influence did that have on Soviet thinking?
Thank you. Simon?
So solidarity is a critical element of this history, of course. On the one hand, I think it certainly is instructive to the Soviets about the real problems that they have, not only in their own country, but also within the Warsaw Pact, about increasing dissatisfaction with the status quo. Now, we know that, for example, Gorbachev really doesn't view the Warsaw Pact leaders fondly at all. At Chernenko's funeral, he brings them all together and he tells them, you're basically on your own. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to be intervening. But I would say that the key issue here is that it shows the possibility, right? The many Soviet leaders, especially in the military, look back on the Soviet non-intervention at the behest of people like Andropov and Dmitry Ustinov. The Soviet non-intervention in Polish affairs is the death knell of the Brezhnev doctrine. Right? And thus, I think it opens up the range of possibilities for action by a lot of leaders. Now, of course, no one really is willing to go as far as kind of 1989 so quickly, but it's pivotal in teaching as a case for the Soviets to take about real problems which they face, and also I think we can see a degree of kind of the emboldenment of some Eastern Bloc leaders based on Soviet non-action.
Thank you. We'll go next to James Mann. James Mann. Please unmute yourself.
There we go.
Yep.
Yes, and thank you for the presentation. I wanted to focus on the last year of the administration. You've spoken about the evolution of policy, and you see it much as I did in my one book on the subject. But you have to, I want to focus on personnel. In that last year of the administration, by the accounts of several senior people, I think of Frank Carlucci, the senior officials of the administration are getting together to make decisions without Reagan. I think Carlucci's quote was, he was past the point where he could intervene in the system to prevent something from happening. So in some ways, he's vastly more detached. And on the other hand, you have a vigorous debate, one that leads to the pause of the next administration, a vigorous debate on, is Gorbachev just another Soviet leader, or does he represent something different? And it's Schultz is the prime advocate. But the question is how much do you find that Reagan is himself participating in that debate or steering that debate, or is he leaving it to others?
Thank you.
I find a very active Reagan on this issue. Part of I think it goes back to the comments I made in response to Eric's really excellent point about the bigger picture. And there certainly are a lot of cases where Reagan allows bureaucrats to kind of, not bureaucrats, they're political appointees, to exercise a lot of initiative with sometimes pretty disastrous consequences. So I don't see it as that simple. And I would simply say that the Soviet Union issue was, to Reagan, I think at this point in particular, when there's a summit on the horizon, the key issue. So for example, on this nature of the Soviet Union, this is when he's doing what Jack Matlock called Soviet Union 101, right? Where he's doing these lengthy seminars with discussion papers talking about not just the nature of the new leader, but also the nature of the Soviet Union. On the nature of the new leader, Reagan actually writes a memo with his own thoughts on this. In October 1985, he dictates a memo with his own thoughts on the matter, and in which, again, here I think we see the evolution from 85 to 89, right? So Reagan is saying, the Soviets would not have let this guy be in charge if they thought he was going to give away the farm. So obviously he is a skilled political operator within the Soviet context. And also he is sort of indefatigably committed to the Soviet cause, perhaps Reagan says the communist cause instead. So Reagan's actually on the record on this debate, right? And at this point, he's saying, Gorbachev, yes, there's some things that make him look more appealing, also things that make him more dangerous. This is a guy who can do PR. This is a guy who has, in Raisa Gorbacheva, a very sort of glamorous, but also engaging and personable wife, which you could not necessarily say of Tatiana Andropova, for example. So this is dangerous too, right? What makes him new makes him a better advocate for his ideology. So I see Reagan is very involved in this. He's actively engaged in this question. He's actually, over policy documents on this very issue. His views change though, over the course of the 1980s, his views undoubtedly change on Gorbachev. But at this early time, he's right in the thick of it.
Thank you. I want to give Elizabeth in a moment a chance to perhaps follow up with another question, but let me bring in two questions that came to us through the email. One is from Philip Brown. Interesting that the Russian archives are so open these days. Given the example of Paul Whelan, American in prison in Russia for the last several years, do you have any fear or concern about visiting and doing research in Russia? And then secondly, from a question by Brad Morith, how do you evaluate the significance of Reagan's attempt to impose sanctions on the Western allies regarding the gas pipeline with the Soviets? Was also Reagan abandoning this plan? All of this in the Pershing II deployment context.
So let me answer the first question simply with a no. Though I'm certainly not unaware of any of those issues. I have nothing but really nice things to say about the archivists and the other folks at the various Moscow archives. That being said, I do take care to comply with all of the visa rules, etc. But the gas pipeline, fascinating issue, kind of apropos of Mary's earlier question about INF, because this is another key source of tension, where on the one hand you have this, if I can perhaps say as a Canadian, this very typical kind of American extraterritoriality, sort of imposition of American standards and norms on the dealings of other countries, which really turns around to bite the Reagan administration. Right. And in particular, Margaret Thatcher, who is generally perceived as kind of Reagan's closest ally, she's probably his harshest critic on the Siberian pipeline issue. So that's another key obstacle to challenge to NATO cohesion. It does not portend well for example, the INF issue. On the one hand, because it's seen as this kind of American overreach and to many people, American arrogance. And on the other hand, because the United States can't get its allies on board. And this is really frustrating to the Reagan administration. But I think, the Reagan in particular backs down to a certain extent on this issue in order to preserve the stability and the solidity of the alliance and not subjected to a perhaps less necessary stress test than deploying the Pershing IIs and the Griffin ground-launched cruise missiles.
Thank you. Elizabeth, any follow-up questions? A short question, since we have a number of questions still waiting.
I don't. I'm going to let you keep going with the audience, but I do want to say I'm apologizing to Simon that my Soviet Frus volumes have not appeared yet, and you have finished this book, but I will tell the audience they should be coming out soon. So the documentation in these two volumes will marry very well with everything Simon has written about and provide you more context of MemCons, all of these discussions with Wilkes and Dobrynin. So look for them soon on the internet.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. A question via email from me, Treadwell. How accurate was the early 1980s CIA estimate on the fragility of Russia's economy in pushing Reagan's economic warfare? Did it empower those who believed a resolution of the Cold War was possible, as opposed to those who thought the USSR would continue contained by us for a much longer time?
The issue of the Soviet economic performance, I guess we could say, is kind of a book in and of itself. But one thing that I was really struck by, especially in the early 1980s, was the sense that capitalism was really in crisis, right? Now, that doesn't mean that people were looking to the Soviet Union, the Soviet model. But for example, there's a great op-ed that runs in the New York Times in '79, which is called, "Hey Japan, please return the favor and occupy us." And there's a lot of publications at this time, including, for example, if you can get your hands on one of the very original versions of Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, The cover art tells the story of the United States on the decline and Japan coming up behind it. So not kind of communism, socialism, but a much, much more significant role for the government in managing the state economy was seen by many people as a strength, not as a weakness or a liability. And thus, I think that colors a lot of the interpretations of people like Reagan and how they interpret, how they orient themselves towards these CIA estimates, which are, on the one hand, yes, telling a very bad story about the Soviet economy, but on the other hand, Ronald Reagan at this point is standing up and saying, we're in the worst economic disaster this country has ever seen since the Great Depression. So it's very easy to kind of look back on the late 80s and think that that's kind of the economic climate. But early 80s, you're talking about a recession, barely gotten out of stagflation. The memory of panic at the pump, so to speak, is a fresh one. And thus, when American policymakers read these memos saying, things are really bad in the Soviet Union, a lot of them are saying, true. But one, we think that they can recover from that in a way that our economy might not be able to. And two, things are not so great here.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you. We have, I want to see if we can get 3 more questions really quick in, one after another, and then give Simon a final chance to respond before Eric will wrap up today's event. Let me first call on Csaba Békés. Csaba, please unmute yourself. A brief question.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you. Hi, Christian. Hi, everybody. The brief question is after a comment. The comment is that thank you very much for the presentation, and I like the presentation of this first Reagan period very much because it's very much in coincidence with the views which I have for many years about this issue. So I haven't seen the book yet, but I definitely will. So I'm very happy that there is a scholarly book based on documents, much more documents which I could see, and then coming up with the same evaluation. The other thing is a very short comment on the Brezhnev doctrine, which I perceived in a way, the comment what Simon said, that you believe that already in 1985 when Gorbachev talked about non-intervention to the Warsaw Pact leaders, that was something serious. I don't agree with that if that's your point, because my position is very different. According to that, it was in the summer of 1988 when the Soviets actually gave up the idea of military intervention. And then the question, because it's a question then, is about the SDI. What was the role of SDI in the summitry, in the summit meetings between Gorbachev and Reagan, where we, of course, have the documents for a long time now, and we see how Gorbachev was actually begging Reagan at all possible occasions to give up on the idea of SDI, and Reagan said no. So how do you evaluate this? What was the role of this?
Thanks, Csaba. Appreciate it. Yafang Shah. Please unmute yourself. And a brief question.
I have read the book, so I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about the relation between Reagan's grand strategy and the Reagan doctrine, and Reagan's grand strategy and Reaganomics. And did U.S. economic situation matter in the 1980s for the Reagan administration to carry out its grand strategy? Thank you.
Thanks, Yafang. Finally, we go to Robert Shadler. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, Bob Shadler, American Foreign Policy Council, Senior Fellow in Public Diplomacy. George Shultz, in his memoir, said that the day Pershing IIs arrived in Germany was the equivalent of D-Day for the Reagan administration. One of Reagan's iconic moments was when he said in Berlin, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." this was arguably not a message to Mr. Gorbachev so much as a public diplomacy effort to influence many other audiences. So I would like any comments you would have on the public diplomacy effort during the 80s to make the INF issue compatible for a resolution, given the fact that European governments had signed on more or less to this decision in 1979, but they had a great deal of domestic opposition. So any comments on the role of public diplomacy on the INF issue?
Thank you very much. We're already past our time. So Simon, a quick response. You probably don't have time to respond to each question individually, and hopefully the conversation can continue bilaterally afterwards. Simon?
Let me just very briefly say, on Gorbachev's comments at Chernenko's funeral about the Eastern Bloc being kind of on their own, I think that they don't necessarily take him seriously, the leadership of the various Warsaw Pact countries, but I think Gorbachev means it quite seriously. But perhaps if you can get your hands on a copy of the book, you can see the reference to the Russian archives where I get this information from. On grand strategy and economy, absolutely it's critical. First of all, it's critical because early in the Reagan term, he needs to focus on the economy. That's the big issue, right? It's the economy. It's not foreign policy. And this is something that actually makes a lot of Eastern Bloc policymakers welcome his election. Which is a counterintuitive aspect of Reagan from what we know happens later. But many people, for example, in the Czechoslovak foreign ministry say, this is great. He's just going to focus on the economy. He's not going to nail us on human rights like Jimmy Carter never stopped doing. So that's critical. And also that economic strength and the recovery emboldens the shift from covert to overt diplomacy, which I talked about earlier on. Apropos of overt diplomacy, especially public diplomacy when it comes to INF, it's undeniable that they certainly were not very good at it, right? They send out William Buckley, the so-called Buckley mission, whose job it is to kind of bring everyone on board, and he comes back and he's not really persuaded that he's succeeded in any way, shape, or form. This is not, by the way, William F. Buckley, the conservative pundit. This is William Buckley, a State Department official. Easy to get the two, easy to imagine a difference. So the public diplomacy on this, not very successful, overcome by a lot of quiet diplomacy, especially with US NATO allies, a critical aspect of the Cold War story.
Thank you. With my thanks to you, Simon, Elizabeth, and of course, Mary, over to Eric for some final words.
And my thanks to you, Simon, Elizabeth, Mary, and Christian, as well as those of you posing questions from the audience. And apologies to those of you with questions that we couldn't get to. There's a lot more ahead for the Washington History Seminar. Please join us this coming Friday, October 23rd at 4 p.m. for the next installment of the seminar.
3:30.
Excuse me?
3:30 p.m.
3:30 p.m. Excuse me. 3:30 p.m. for the next installment of the seminar featuring historian Helmut Walser-Smith and his new book, Germany, A Nation in Its Time Before, During, and After Nationalism, 1500 to 2000. And then we hope to see you days later, next Monday, October 26th, for a session on Alan Du Bois's book, Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote. Till then, take care and stay safe.